Rick was no stranger to hardship. Living in a rundown apartment with his ailing mother, he spent his days scraping by, tending to her needs while juggling odd jobs to keep them afloat. 3 years ago, tragedy had struck like a thunderbolt. This mother, lost in the pages of her Bible, had pulled out a gun and ended her life before Rick could stop her. The memory haunted him, a wound that refused to heal. Yet, life demanded he press on, and so he did, carrying the weight of grief and poverty with quiet resolve. One crisp morning, Rick arrived at his job at a local warehouse, only to be met with crushing news. He'd been replaced. No explanation, no warning, just a curt dismissal that left him reeling. Desperate, he turned to his old friend Jeremy, who, through some quick string pulling, secured him a gig at a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town. The place was unlike anything Rick had ever seen: ornate chandeliers, marble floors, and an air of old money that made him feel small. His task was simple: manual labor, moving crates, and cleaning up after renovations. But the job came with a catch-and-icy manager named Antoinette, who seemed to take an instant dislike to him. During a break, Rick nicked his hand on a rusty nail. Seeking a first aid kit, he approached Antoinette, who scoffed at his request, berating him for interrupting her. When he insisted he'd bandage himself and get back to work, she relented, leading him into the mansion's opulent interior. As he patched up his wound in a dimly lit room, another maid whispered something to Antoinette, who promptly ordered Rick out. On his way, his eyes fell on a stack of cash left carelessly on a table. Hunger gnawed at him, and memories of unpaid bills flashed through his mind. In a moment of weakness, he slipped a couple of notes into his pocket. As he stepped out of the room, his heart stopped. There, seated in a high-backed chair, was the mansion's owner, Mr. Georgia, gaunt, silver-haired man with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through him. Rick froze, certain he'd been caught. Antoinette stormed in, her face a mask of fury, and fired him on the spot. Terrified, Rick stammered apologies, pleading his poverty and desperation. To his shock, Mr. George waved off Antoinette's outrage. Instead of punishment, he handed Rick the entire wad of cash as an advance payment for reasons he didn't explain. Bewildered but relieved, Rick left the mansion, his mind racing. That night, Rick moved in with Jeremy to save on rent. Over cheap beers, Jeremy teased him about his sudden windfall, asking what he'd do if he had real wealth. Rick's answer came easily. He'd travel the world, see every corner of it. But first, he'd win back his ex-girlfriend Tanya. Jeremy laughed, calling him a hopeless romantic, and the conversation drifted into the night. The next morning, as Rick and Jeremy divvied up chores, a messenger arrived with an urgent summons from Mr. George. Back at the mansion, the old man greeted Rick with an unsettling warmth. In a private study lined with leather-bound books, Mr. George revealed a startling truth. He had no heir, a regret that gnawed at him. Leaning closer, he asked Rick if he believed in God. When Rick nodded, Mr. George made an offer that turned his blood cold. If Rick agreed to eat a meal off his corpse after his death, he would inherit the entirety of his fortune. The proposition sounded like a sick joke, but Mr. George's steely gaze suggested otherwise. "This could change your life," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Stunned, Rick mumbled an excuse and fled, the words echoing in his skull. Determined to escape the bizarre encounter, Rick threw himself into finding another job, but the city seemed to conspire against him. Doors closed, leads dried up, and his savings dwindled. Then, one evening, a knock at his door revealed a man in a black suit, holding an invitation to return to the mansion. Against his better judgment, Rick went. Antoinette met him at the entrance, her expression unreadable. Mr. George was dead, she announced, and a contract awaited Rick's signature. The terms were as grotesque as before. Eat a meal off George's body, finish every bite, and the fortune was his. Silence the matter forever, or the deal was off. Rick's stomach churned, but years of scraping by had worn him down. He was tired of hunger, tired of loss. With a trembling hand, he agreed. The ritual was a nightmare made real. In a candlelit chamber, Mr. George's body lay on a table, pale and still. Servants placed a plate of food, steaming meat and vegetables directly on his chest. Antoinette stood nearby, her voice sharp as she reminded Rick to finish every morsel. Gagging, he forced himself to eat, each bite a battle against nausea. When the plate was finally empty, Antoinette handed him a card inscribed with Mr. George's final words. "From this day, you take my burdens, and in exchange, your pure soul is mine." Rick, dazed and sickened, signed the contract without fully reading it, desperate to be done. That night, as he collapsed onto his bed, a strange sensation gripped him. The room seemed to shimmer, and suddenly, he felt submerged, as if drowning in an invisible sea. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision figures that whispered and wailed, their eyes hollow with accusation. Terrified, Rick bolted upright, but the apparitions vanished. Sleep eluded him, and the next morning, he wandered the mansion's halls, jumpy and paranoid. A man stared at him from across a corridor, only to disappear when Rick blinked. Antoinette intercepted him, brushing off his panic with practiced calm. "You're the master now," she said, pressing an unlimited credit card into his hand. "Enjoy your new life." Rick tried to embrace his fortune. He visited Jeremy, offering him money that his friend refused with a grin. There, he ran into Tanya, who eyed him curiously and asked if he'd hit the lottery. "Something better," Rick replied, but his attempt to rekindle their romance fell flat. She didn't trust him, not yet. At a high-end club, he ordered the priciest whiskey, only to be mocked by a stranger who sneered that he didn't belong. Furious, Rick bought 2 Bottlestone for himself, one for the man proving his newfound power. But the thrill was fleeting. Back at the mansion, drunk and unsteady, he glimpsed a woman in a white dress. When he touched his face, his fingers came away bloody, but the woman was gone. Moments later, she reappeared, screaming that he was guilty before lunging at him. Rick fell, gasping, as the world dissolved into water again, only to wake on the floor, unharmed, but shaken. Desperate for answers, Rick confronted Antoinette, accusing her of drugging him. She sighed, her demeanor shifting to something almost pitying. Handing him the contract, and Mr. George's final words, she watched as realization dawned. The truth was worse than he'd feared. Before his death, George had dabbled in dark rituals, seeking to transfer his sins to another to escape damnation. The meal Rick had eaten wasn't just food, it was a conduit for George's guilt, a twisted practice known as sign eating. Rick was now a sign eater, burdened with the old man's crimes and haunted by the spirits tied to them. Horrified, Rick sought redemption at a church, but the priest demanded he confess his sins Rick couldn't name, for they weren't his own. Defeated, he returned to the mansion and interrogated the staff about Mr. George. When no one talked, he threatened to fire Antoinette, who finally relented. She laid out police records, an audio tape, and George's confessions. Among them was a chilling accusation. George had murdered his wife, Susan, though he'd never admitted it. Rick's heart sank. The vengeful spirit attacking him was Susan's, her rage now directed at him. He returned to the church, confessing George's crime as his own. The priest prayed for absolution, and as he did, Susan's spirit appeared, strangling Rick in a fit of fury. The priest's prayers drove her away, but Rick's relief was short-lived. Tanya called, worried about Jeremy's strange behavior, urging Rick to check on him. That night, as Rick watched TV, a figure loomed beside him. A lamp crashed, and a masked man chased him through the mansion. Fleeing upstairs, Rick encountered a blood-soaked child, another of George's victims. Antoinette found him cowering and revealed a grim truth. George himself had been a sign eater, inheriting sins from another before passing them to Rick. The cycle was endless, she warned, unless Rick found someone to take his place. Desperate to escape, Rick considered his options. Antoinette suggested Jeremy, but Rick recoiled at betraying his friend. Then Jeremy called, pleading for money to escape a dire situation. Rick rushed to his aid, gun in hand for protection. At Jeremy's place, a figure begged for help. An apparition, he thought. Panicked, he fired, only to realize too late it was Tanya, now dead at his feet. Antoinette's driver whisked him away, promising to handle the fallout. But Rick's guilt was unbearable. He resolved to end the curse, even if it meant passing it to Jeremy. When Jeremy arrived, grieving Tanya but desperate for work, Antoinette proposed he become a sign eater. Naive and broke, he agreed, thinking it a mere formality. Rick lay on a table as doctors prepared the ritual, injecting him with a drug that stopped his heart. In a limbo-like realm, he faced the spirits again, including his mother, who morphed into Tanya. They forgave each other, and his mother's spirit shielded him from the other's wrath. Revived, Rick learned Jeremy had completed the ritual, taking on his burdens. 6 months later, Rick was back to manual labor, free but haunted by Tanya's memory. In a quiet park, her spirit sat beside him, not a threat, but a bittersweet presence, a reminder of love lost. He hadn't fully passed his sins to Jeremy. Tanya's death was his to bear. Meanwhile, Antoinette added Jeremy's name to a book of sign eaters, her eyes gleaming as his screams echoed through the mansion. The cycle continued, and more would follow.